Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, we're back at it with another big Spider-Man Remastered benchmark, but this time I'll be focusing on CPU performance. Last week, we threw 43 GPUs at the game to see which models performed the best in their respective price ranges, but I did note at the time that CPU performance seemed to be a real concern for this game, with very high utilization observed when using the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. And following that video, many of you reported seeing much lower performance than what we showed with the 5800X 3D, and of course many of you did note that you were using a slower processor, so now we're going to get a good look at just how much of a difference your CPU can make when it comes to frame rates in Spider-Man Remastered. For this testing, I've gone with the GeForce RTX 3090 Ti with display driver GeForce Game Ready 516.94, and I'll be testing it not just 1080p but also 1440p and 4K, using a range of quality settings including the medium preset, very high quality preset, and then a ray tracing configuration which will be using the high quality preset. So there will be loads of data to go over. Now for the memory, all CPUs have been tested using dual rank, dual channel DDR4 3200CL14, so it's very much an apples to apples comparison in terms of memory performance. Having said that though, I have included a second configuration for the Core i9 1200K using DDR5 6400. Now, when compared to the GPU benchmark pass, I have tweaked the CPU pass a bit. It's very similar, but I've included a few quick twitches with a web sling at the end. So with that, let's get into the results. First up, we have the medium quality preset data at 1080p, and I'll start from the top where we find the 1200K using DDR5 6400 memory, allowing for 175 FPS on average, which was a 17% improvement when compared to the DDR4 3200 configuration. Now, the 5800X 3D, which was used for the GPU testing, is slower than the DDR5-enabled 1200K, trailing by a 7% margin with 162 FPS on average. That said, it was 8% faster than the 1200K when using the same DDR4 memory. Now, as you'd probably expect, the Alder Lake CPUs did outperform the standard Zen 3 desktop parts, though in such a CPU-intensive game, you might not have expected the 12600K to be able to match the 5950X. And not just that, but also the E-Core disabled 12400 to come in ahead of the 5900X. Quite surprisingly, the 11th Gen Core processors also performed really well, as the 11900K can be seen matching the 5900X, which isn't unheard of, but half the time the 11900K ends up slower than the 10900K. Meanwhile, the 11700K and 5800X can also be seen neck and neck, meaning the 12700K was 16% faster than AMD's 8-core Zen 3 part when using the same memory. Then we have the 5600X and 11600K, which can be found delivering a similar level of performance, though the 1% lows of the 6-core Zen 3 part were slightly stronger and much stronger than that of the 10-core 10900K. It's also very interesting to see the 5600X beating the 10900K and delivering almost 10% greater 1% low performance after all the talk of games needing more cores, especially in what appears to be one of the most CPU demanding games we've ever seen. That's not to say that the 8, 12 and 16 core Zen 3 CPUs aren't faster, they clearly are, but the 5600X had no issue delivering high refresh rate performance without a hitch. Interestingly, the 4-core, 8-thread Core i3 12100 also managed to deliver perfectly playable, smooth performance with 115 FPS on average. And I did play the game for about half an hour or so with this CPU just to see what it was like, and the numbers here don't lie. The Core i3 was flawless despite a constant utilization of over 90%, and often it was maxed out. It was also very interesting to see the 12100 beating the Core i7 10700K. Intel's 10th gen isn't particularly impressive here despite working well enough, and perhaps we'll explore that a bit later on. Now, the bottom half of the graph is dominated by AMD, and there are a few reasons for this. The primary reason being that I didn't test many low-end or older Intel CPUs, as it is a serious pain in the backside to do so. All of the AMD CPUs you see tested here were done so in a single system using the MSI X570S Carbon Max Wi-Fi motherboard. For Intel though, I was forced to use 3 different test systems just for the results shown here, and if I wanted to go back and test first-gen Ryzen's competitors, I'd need yet another Intel test system. And we already know parts such as the Core i7 7600K, they're done for, so I don't really want to spend another day or so flogging that dead horse. So we're not bashing AMD here, rather we're saying Intel's older CPUs are just too difficult and too slow to even bother with. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's proceed. The Ryzen 5 5500 and Ryzen 7 3800X and 5700G were all good for around 106 to 108 FPS in our test with similar 1% low performance. Then we have the Core i5 10400F roughly matching the Ryzen 5 3600, Ryzen 3 3300X and Ryzen 5 5600G, all with around 100 FPS on average. The old Core i3 10105F, which is basically the 10100, that managed to crack the 90 FPS barrier, which is still very playable in this title, and that put it alongside the Ryzen 3 5300G. Then old Zen Plus parts such as the Ryzen 7 2700X and Ryzen 5 2600X, they performed quite poorly really, especially relative to the more modern processors, but we're still looking at 78 FPS on average with 1% lows of 63 FPS when paired with high quality memory. Now, the first gen Ryzen CPUs, they should be going up against Intel's 7th generation, and they did dip below 60 FPS for 1% lows. You'll certainly notice some slowdown here, especially if you're used to 60 FPS plus. I'm not going to pour over the 1440p medium quality data, as here we are still heavily CPU limited, and therefore the data doesn't really change that much. We're looking at very similar margins to what was just seen at 1080p. We're also looking at around a 3% decline in performance at the high end, as the RTX 3090 Ti drops a few frames at the higher resolution, so I think it's best that we just move on to the 4K data. As you'd expect, the game becomes more GPU bound at 4K, though this is only true when using a high-end CPU, and interestingly, the 5800X 3D manages to overtake the Core i9 1200K, even when pairing the Intel CPU with DDR5 memory. The margin though is very small, just a 3% win for the 5800X 3D. The 12900K was also just 4% faster using DDR5 6400 opposed to DDR4 3200, so for those of you using a high-end GPU targeting high resolution such as 4K, which I assume you'd be doing for a single-player action game, memory performance is far less of an issue. The 5950X was again similar to the 12600K and 11900K, pushing 130 FPS, while the 5900X was just 3% slower, matching the much cheaper 12400F, a personal favourite of ours. Then further down we find the 5600X with 117 FPS on average, and although that only made it slightly faster than the 11400, it did outpace the 10900K. Meanwhile, the Core i3 12100 was again very impressive with strong 1% low performance and 112 FPS on average. Below that we find the 10700K, 10900K and 10600K all delivering similar performance with just over 100 FPS on average. Also, the Ryzen 5 5500, Ryzen 7 3800X and 5700G also delivered a similar level of performance. Again, it's not until we get down to the Zen and Zen Plus parts that the performance really starts to drop away. Now, we have the very high quality preset, and once again, we'll start with the 1080p results. We see that here the 1200K using DDR5 6400 memory topped our chart, this time with 165 FPS, making it 7% faster than the 5800X 3D and 17% faster than its DDR4 3200 configuration. And that means when using the same DDR4 memory, the 5800X 3D was actually 9% faster than the 12900K. But it also means that the 12900K, 12700K and 12600K are all a good bit faster than the non-3D V-Cache Zen 3 processors, such as the 5950X, 5900X, 5800X, and of course the 5600X. The 8-core, 12-core and 16-core Zen 3 processors all delivered basically the same results, with the 5600X just dropping off the pace a little bit to come in 6% slower, but again, frame pacing was good. Intel's 11th gen was again impressive here, and the 11400 came in just behind the 5600X, as did the 12th gen Core i3 12100. Again, it's Intel's 10th generation that wasn't particularly impressive, and the 10-core 10900K couldn't even beat the 5600X. Further down we see that the Ryzen 5 5500 was able to beat the Core i5 10600K, and that the Ryzen 5 3600 matched the average frame rate of the Core i5 10400F, but delivered much stronger 1% lows. The Ryzen 3 5300G performed surprisingly well and easily outperformed the Core i3 10105F, particularly when looking at the 1% lows. And then again, at the very bottom of our graph, we find the Zen and Zen Plus processors with sub 60 FPS 1% lows. Again, the 1440p data is very much CPU limited, and therefore the results don't change all that much from what we just saw at 1080p. We see a bit of movement at the top end, but other than that, the standings and margins are all very much the same. And this means for many of you with a mid-range to high-end GPU, lowering the quality settings won't actually boost your frame rate when playing Spider-Man Remastered. Most CPUs, such as the Core i9 10900K, dropped just 2 FPS when going from 1080p to 1440p, and then we just saw an 8 FPS reduction from 1440p medium to very high. So many of you might as well just crank up the visual quality settings and enjoy the single-player title in all of its glory. Now, once again, 4K is where the game becomes GPU limited, even with an extreme high-end graphics card such as the GeForce RTX 3090 Ti. We're still seeing an improvement in 1% lows, but they're not nearly as significant as what was shown when more CPU limited at lower resolutions such as 1080p and 1440p. The 1% lows of the Core i5 12400F, for example, only trailed the DDR5-enabled 1200K by an 8% margin, whereas at 1440p that margin was 26%. The Zen 3 CPUs topped out here at 108 FPS, which is just 2 FPS less than that of the Intel CPUs, though we are seeing slightly slower 1% lows of up to 6 FPS. It's also worth noting though that from the Core i3 1200 up, you'd have a hard time telling any of these configurations apart under these test conditions, which frankly I'd consider to be the most real-world testing shown so far for someone using an RTX 3090 Ti. Closely following the 12100, we find the 11400, 10900K, 10700K, and 9900K, all of which delivered highly playable performance. The Ryzen 7 5700G and Ryzen 5 5500 were also there, both delivering strong 1% low performance. Then, for around 90 FPS, the Ryzen 3 5300G, 3300X, 5600G, 10400F, 3600, and 3800X were all right around the mark. The Core i3 10105F did have some consistency issues, as did the Zen and Zen Plus processors. Now, as you'd expect, enabling ray tracing even with the slightly dialed down high quality preset greatly reduces frame rates even at 1080p. But as many have noted, it does increase CPU usage further, so given that, these results might surprise you. Despite the higher CPU usage, lower core count CPUs don't appear to suffer. The Core i3 12100, for example, was just 6% slower than the 12400F, and you can really attribute that to the difference in cache capacity rather than the core count. And it's the same deal when looking at Zen 3 processors. The 5600X is now much closer to the 5800X, 5900X, and 5950X, basically matching them. Yet despite that, the DDR5-enabled Core i9 12400K runs away with it, delivering almost 20% more performance than the 5800X 3D, and a massive 36% improvement over its DDR4 configuration. Now, as far as I can tell, enabling ray tracing in this game significantly increases the amount of traffic crossing the PCI Express bus. It also increases the amount of system memory used, and therefore the amount of data being shifted in and out of memory. So although CPU usage has increased, it appears as though the memory bandwidth is the primary bottleneck here, at least for most processors. What is apparent is that throwing more cores at the problem isn't the solution, which is a bit surprising given the game will spread the load quite well across 12 cores. But like most games, it does appear to be very much primary thread dependent. And that means individual core performance is key, and it's why the 12400K is so fast relative to the 5950X. It's also why the 5950X, 5900X, 5800X, and 5600X are all very similar here, while the difference in performance between the 12th gen core processors can be largely attributed to the difference in L3 cache capacity. Now, if you were to look at CPU utilization alone, you would have, for example, expected the Core i3 12100 to just crumble here, but that certainly wasn't the case, and in fact it comfortably beat the 10-core Core i9 10900K, again suggesting that IPC is king rather than core count, at least within reason. More evidence that this can be seen with AMD's APUs. The 5700G, for example, has 8 cores with 16 threads, but half the L3 cache of the Zen 3 CPU models, such as the 5600X, which were almost 20% faster. The 5300G halves the cache again, and this is likely why the 5700G was 15% faster. Also, the Zen and Zen Plus processors aren't particularly impressive when it comes to cache and memory performance, and like the APUs, they also lack PCI Express 4.0 support, which could be playing a role here, and we'll look at that shortly. So despite packing 8 cores with 16 threads, the 1800X and 2700X really struggled in this title. As we found with the medium and very high quality preset testing, moving to 1440p from 1080p, it does very little to change the margins, and that was also true with ray tracing enabled. The DDR5 enabled Core i9 1200K was still much faster than its DDR4 version, as well as AMD's 5800X 3D. Then the rest of the results, which were very much CPU limited, remain almost exactly the same. Now, as we move to the 4K resolution, the game becomes increasingly GPU limited at the high end, but still very much CPU limited for the bulk of the results. The GPU limit at the high end means that the DDR5 configuration for the 1200K offered very little benefit over DDR4, and that the 5800X 3D was able to roughly match its performance. Then the Core i7 12700K and Zen 3 processors all delivered basically the same level of performance, along with the 12600K and really even the 12400F. The next tier down still managed to maintain 60 FPS for the 1% lows, and this included the 12100, 11900K, 11700K, and 11600K. The Ryzen 5 5500, Ryzen 7 3800X, and Ryzen 5 3600 also managed to break the 60 FPS barrier for the 1% lows. In fact, most of the CPUs tested delivered satisfactory performance under these test conditions, with the only exceptions being the Core i3 10105F, along with the Zen and Zen Plus processors. Now, before wrapping up this testing, here's a look at how Resizable BAR influences performance in Spider-Man Remastered, and as you can see, it just doesn't. The results should be the same with or without this PCI Express feature enabled, which is really true of most games. The only exception here would be for Intel's Arc GPUs, which will likely benefit from the technology, but this isn't true for Radeon or GeForce GPUs, and we are showing the Radeon RX 6800 XT here. Now here's a look at DDR4 3200CL14 performance in a single rank and then a dual rank configuration, which is what we use for testing. As we've found in the past, dual rank memory typically offers good performance gains in games, and here we're looking at an 8% uplift at 1080p and a 6% gain at 1440p. Certainly not massive, but still impressive given the frequency and timings remain the same. Now, here's a quick look at some cheap DDR4 3800CL19 modules versus our dual-rank DDR4 3200CL14 memory. This time we're looking at a 10 to 12% performance advantage using our test configuration over high-clocked but also high-latency memory. Then finally, I wanted to take a quick look at PCI Express performance with the Core i9 1200K using DDR5 6400 memory. Now, for a bit of context, the biggest difference we've seen previously when using an RTX 3080 between PCIe 3.0 and 4.0 was about a 5% margin, though admittedly, I haven't looked at this for quite some time. Even so, I was shocked to find a 9% performance improvement at 1080p using PCIe 4.0 over 3.0. That's quite a large margin. Of course, as we've found in the past, that margin almost entirely evaporates at 4K, where we're driving fewer frames. Still, the 1080p results were eye-opening, and it means for those of you using not just slower DDR memory, but also an older PCI interface, that can be sacrificing quite a lot of performance. And this is possibly another reason why Intel's 10th gen series performed a bit weaker than expected, as they are limited to PCIe 3.0. Something that a lot of you mentioned in the comments from the GPU benchmark video was the fact that Spider-Man Remastered has a lot of performance-related issues, from frame stuttering to memory leaks. Now, I certainly don't doubt those claims for a second, as there was no shortage of reports online, but I can tell you that I ran into no such issues, either playing the game, which I've now done for several hours using various configurations, or from our detailed benchmarking. The game's been buttery smooth for me, with the exception of a few older configurations using Zen and Zen Plus processors, and I expect the experience to be dramatically worse with, say, a Core i5 7600K, as the Core i3 10105F, which is basically a 7700K, which is basically a 6700K, it wasn't very good. Now, I don't know why my experience was so flawless to what many of you are reporting online, but as always with computers, it could be any number of things, from the exact hardware configuration to what we do or don't have installed in Windows. Hopefully though, future game patches will address any and all performance-related issues. Now, assuming that you're in the clear like we are, most CPUs will enable a good gaming experience here, particularly newer models. AMD Zen 3 CPUs performed really well, as did Intel's 11th and 12th gen series. It was really interesting to see how this game behaved with ray tracing enabled, and if you were to just look at CPU utilization, you'd be given the wrong impression. This is often why we don't like to quote CPU utilization numbers, as they can be very misleading. It does appear though that as long as you have at least 4 cores with 8 threads on a modern processor, the game will run just fine. And instead, the key here, as always, is IPC performance, with a heavy emphasis on memory and PCIe bandwidth, or at least that was the case with the 12900K. I probably don't need to waffle on any longer. The results really said it all. This was a massive undertaking, so I hope you guys found the results interesting. I know I did. And Spider-Man Remastered is certainly going to join the many games we test with on a regular basis. You can now do the like thing, subscribe if you want more content, and you can also join us at Floatplane or Patreon. Links for those are in the video description. You'll get access to stuff like our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams to myself get together and talk about whatever's interesting or whatever you guys want us to talk about. We also have behind the scenes content, Q&A, so a lot of cool stuff there if you're interested. But if not, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.